I mean, you probably think, oh my God, he's mad. He's doing. How long can one man talk about sugar tongs? It's a huge field in collecting. There have been 2 books written in the last 10, 15 years. One by David Schlossberg on tea tongs, and one by Graham Hodges on sugar tongs. And they actually both have websites. So if you type in silver tea tongs and you type in silver sugar tongs into your search engines, they will pop up. And they'll probably be far more informative than I ever will be in these short videos. But this is to get you started. And, you know, the minute you've heard me waffle on and talk a load of old nonsense, you can immediately go on their websites and find out that almost everything I told you is factually incorrect. Let's talk about these. I must say, you know, just being commercial for a moment, most of the pairs I'm going to show you are for sale. They are available, and they're not tons of money. But let's talk about tea tongs. Sounds like an intervention, doesn't it? Let's talk about tea tongs. They are cast. How are they made? They are cast. And why is this important? It's important because when you cast silver, it is nowhere near as strong as when you hammer it out into shape as you do with spoons and forks and other pieces of flatware. When you're hammering and annealing, which is the annealing process, is heating it up, letting the molecules relax and heating it up again and hammering along, you're changing the material structure of the silver. You're making it tough and you're making it springy. When you cast silver, it's molten, so it's in its weakest state. It's allowed to set and cool. Nothing happens to it. It's only as strong as the metal itself. And that's assuming you've got no air bubbles or impurities in your casting. And if you do get those, and they did a lot, you will have numerous weak points. Originally, when these were made, and they had the rectangular hinge, the hinge is important. They were of a 2-piece hinge construction because they were cast in 2 separate pieces. So rather than like sides of a scissor, you'd have one part like that with the ring, half the hinge and the arm, and all cast in one. And it's said that, you know, these are cast from cuttlefish, which is a very old Roman technique where you take a piece of cuttlefish, yes, the stuff you shove in the birdcage for the parrot to nibble, a piece of cuttlefish, you smooth it down, you impress it with a master design, and then you cast one from it. It's not a very detailed process if you do it. I am sceptical that's how they made these. Maybe they did. If they did, they probably weren't very good. The other ways you can do it are sand casting. So you get a master template, either in wood or in brass. You press it into sand, moistened sand, so it takes an impression, and then you make another mould on top, and you cut various channels into it, and you pour the metal in. That makes quite a good casting. And actually, if those moulds, and I don't know if they were, but if those moulds were lined with plumbago, which is basically the 18th century form of graphite, I can believe that, you know, that would have worked and would have allowed very fine castings. The other option, of course, is that they used the lost wax method, and they had a sort of master mould to make the wax versions of all of these, and then they set them in a sort of loose clay of fine sand, and then they made the mould. And that's the most detailed way of making a casting. And certainly, although we won't look at any today or touch on them, the Rococo pairs that you get of these, where they are cast vines and leaves and they're all intertwining and moving, those must have been lost wax castings. They're too fine, really, to be anything else. So we've got this simple form and we've got this simple hinge. And when they made these 2 pieces, they very simply put a little rivet through the two sides, hammered them over, and then they probably do a nice bit of turning, bit of decorative turning to hide the rivet. The problem with that, let me demonstrate with my hands, is you've got two pieces with a rivet going through like that, and you're doing this with them all day, they start to banjo out. All the force is on that little rivet, and instead of just going like that, they start to go like this, and they loosen, and the rivet becomes loose, and they wobble. They wobble. You'll find this on early pairs. You can probably hold them by the finger ring and they'll wobble, 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 wobble. These are the sort of the version up from that. And some bright smart thought, well, actually, what we'll do is we'll get two plates fixed to one arm, and we'll have a plate in the middle. So that will hold that in place, and it will only move in that direction. There'll be no outward play. Sometimes these are very obviously pinned. Sometimes they aren't pinned at all, and you can hold the arms like this and they'll actually move back and forth. These, you see, don't. So you open them up like this, and there's no reason why, if there isn't a pin in there, that they won't move slightly, but they don't. So I believe that when this was assembled, there is a small internal pin. I'm obviously not going to chop them open to find out if there is, but the way that they move, it makes sense that some of these better quality and later tongs do have a small internal pin in them, just to steady everything together. Obviously, when you're making a hinge in this fashion, you can't cast one entire arm and the hinge, because this hinge has to be soldered and assembled. So what you will be doing is you will be casting one piece with the internal hinge here, which is obviously circular, and then you might have this as a separate piece, this is a separate piece, and the two plates, and then you'll assemble it all together and solder it up. The advantage of having this circular area without any need for sort of bullseye turning, nothing to do with the darts game show, I promise you, is you have an area at last to put a lovely bit of engraving. It's very nice to find an initial on there, a period initial. Lovely to find a date, because these never, hardly ever, maybe one or two pairs are known with date letters. It was not required. You will only ever find these marked with the maker's mark, possibly just the maker's mark, or the maker's mark and the standard mark, the lion passant. The earliest pairs, which have sort of spoon-shaped bowls, are either marked on the outside of the bowl, and then a little bit later on they're marked on the inside of the bowl. When you get to this stage, which is 1750, when they're at their height, 1740, 1750, 1760, they're always marked on the finger ring. Maker's mark and standard mark, maker's mark and standard mark. But as I say, because you've got this area now, you can have your initials on them, or the thing that makes a piece of silver lovely to my eye, a period crest. Now, I'll put pictures of these on Instagram individually, but you might be able to see a stag. There's a finely engraved stag there. He's a stag tripant, because his foot's up. I don't know, he's trod on something he didn't like. But what's really special about this pair is that on the reverse side, you have, for the same person, you have their initials engraved, not in script, as it was common at this period. So they'll just have nice script initials, or they'll have them in nice capitals. These are engraved in a cipher. Now, ciphers are an earlier form, a 17th century form of engraving elaborate initials. Basically, they intertwine all the initials, and if you cut them down the middle, they're a mirror image of either side. So they're Someone's told me to put my hand behind things, but I think not, because my phone's so dreadful it doesn't work. But you'll see that they have a cipher. So these are the sort of bells and whistles version of cast arm tongs. Cast arm tongs have their problems. They are cast. Cast arm T-tongs break. Out of 100 pairs of cast T-tongs, you might find 10 that look perfect. Might not be perfect, but they look perfect. The majority, the next 80, will all have small visible repairs. You know, maybe it was some muscular Jane Austen looking lady that came for tea. She got the tongs and she was just a little bit too eager with the sugar cubes and she bent them. Or somebody dropped them and there was a flaw in the casting and it just hit it at the right point. So you will see quite a number of these with repairs. As long as that's reflected in the price, that's fine. You will also see some pairs of these that look like they've been set on top of a hand grenade and it's gone off. Those, unless they were some insane provincial rarity, I wouldn't touch with a barge pole. Have you seen the repair on these? I've been brandishing them at you long enough. It's just there. That's the weakest part, probably, when you're using them on a pair of these tongs. It's only 1.5 millimeters thick. And again, they're cast. And it probably hasn't even broken. It's probably just cracked slightly, and they've sent them off to the silversmith, and they've said, just reinforce that. So he's put a tiny bit of solder there, probably 100 years ago, 150 years ago, and repaired them. It's not the end of the world. These are beautiful things. The styles of them are so myriad that you wouldn't believe it. This is about 1750, 1760. They're by a very good maker, Henry Plumpton. There are a few specialist makers of T-tongs. Plumpton was amongst them. You also get John Gammon. You get Foe and Love. You get Richard Mills. You get William Chatterton. And if you start to collect these, you'll recognise these makers straight off. They were specialists at casting. That's why they made these tongs. They were specialist casters. Many of them appear in directories when you look them up as mould makers, not silversmiths, because mould making is their skill. And many of them, because they were so good at casting, will also produce shoe buckles, because the frames of shoe buckles are cast too. And for them, it was, shall we make a pair of T-tongs? Shall we make a pair of shoe buckles? It didn't really matter if you're making a mould and you're casting. All the same processes apply of finishing and manufacture. So that's just something to be aware of. That a lot of these things you will see in sets with spoons, and you will have the mark of the T-tong maker on the T-tongs, and the spoons will be by a different maker, by a spoon specialist. Occasionally, when these are supplied, their mark will be overstruck, but because it's on a delicate part, and because by the overstriking you could damage them, and then you'd have to send them back, and it would all be more expense, they don't. So I have seen sets, period sets, completely genuine period sets, where the T-tongs do not match, in terms of the maker, the rest of the set. So the moat spoon and the teaspoons will be by a completely different maker. And that just goes to highlight the fact that spoon makers made spoons and T-tong makers made T-tongs. And just because they appeared in sets together, It was 2 different lines of supply. There's still lots more to say about these, but I don't want to send you screaming and running for the hills. I will say, just quickly, that most of the pairs you will see will be made in London. It is very, very rare to get provincial examples of tongs. There are only 1 or 2 Exeter pairs known. There are 2 York pairs known, and I haven't seen either of them, but I believe the person that said they'd seen them. There's only 1 Chester pair known, and only about 4 or 5 Newcastle pairs. So anything provincial in tongs is exceptionally rare and exceptionally expensive if you're lucky enough to find it. As for these, what are these priced at from me? With a small repair by Henry Plumpton, who I think is one of the best specialist makers. He made things to wonderful quality, and with the very rare crest and cipher to the reverse of the triple box hinge. How much are those? They're 270 years old and they're solid silver. They must cost a fortune. Well, they're £90. Not insubstantial amount of money, but for something as rare and beautiful as this, I mean, buttons, really. And if you do collect these and you start to put all the different forms together, very quickly you end up with a spectacular display. But we'll leave this here, and next time you see me, I'll be talking about more tongs. Can you bear it? So, but that's the end for Sugar Tongs Part 2.